Imagine this: you're 6 months pregnant, sitting in your luxury car after a doctor's appointment, when a single text message shatters your perfect world. It's from your husband's mistress, your former best friend, planning a romantic getaway to celebrate their news. But that's just the beginning. What if that betrayal uncovers not just an affair, but a massive criminal empire built on stolen secrets, hidden fortunes, and dangerous alliances that could destroy everything today? We're diving into the gripping tale of Sarah Mitchell, a woman who turns heartbreak into revenge, exposing her millionaire husband's dark secrets and claiming her share of his crumbling empire. From courtroom battles to FBI raids, high-stakes twists, and ultimate empowerment, this story has it all. Stick around to the end because the final twist will leave you speechless. If you're hooked already, hit that like button if you've ever wondered what happens when a betrayed wife fights back. Drop a comment with your thoughts on the wildest plot turn. Share this with a friend who loves drama. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story like this. Let's jump in. The rain streaked down the hospital window like tears on glass, each droplet catching the gray Seattle light before sliding into oblivion. Sarah Mitchell sat in her luxury Range Rover outside the prenatal clinic, one hand resting on her 6-month pregnant belly, the other gripping her phone as if it might explode. The text message glowed on the screen, innocent yet devastating. "Can't wait for our Napa weekend, my love. The Vineyard Suite is perfect for celebrating our news. Love you endlessly. Brooke." Sarah's world tilted on its axis. Brooke Palmer, her former best friend, her husband's head of marketing, and apparently his lover. The irony wasn't lost on her. She just spent the last hour listening to her unborn daughter's heartbeat, marveling at the ultrasound images that showed tiny fingers and toes. David had promised to be here, but another urgent business meeting had taken priority. It always did. Sarah Mitchell had once been a force in the marketing world herself, before David, before the 8-year marriage that had slowly eroded her identity like waves wearing down a cliff. She'd been Sarah Chen then, a rising star at a boutique advertising agency in San Francisco. That was before she met David Mitchell at a tech conference, before his startup dreams became her dreams, before she willingly stepped aside to let him build his empire. Now at 35, she was simply Mrs. David Mitchell, trophy wife to a tech millionaire whose AI startup was valued at $50 million. She lived in a glass mansion in Bellevue, drove cars worth more than most people's homes, and wore clothes that cost more than teachers' monthly salaries. Yet sitting in this parking lot, rain drumming on the roof of her luxury vehicle, she had never felt more poor. Her phone buzzed again. David this time. "Sorry, babe, running late from the office. How did the appointment go? Is our little princess healthy?" The casual endearment felt like a slap. Our little princess. As if he cared about anything beyond how this pregnancy would enhance his public image. The successful tech CEO with the beautiful pregnant wife. The perfect family man facade that Silicon Valley investors love to see. Sarah's marketing mind, dormant for years but never truly dead, began to piece together a timeline. David's increased travel to Napa, the new vineyard investment he'd mentioned in passing, Brooke's recent promotion to head of marketing, a position Sarah herself might have held in another life. The expensive jewelry charges on their credit card statements that never resulted in gifts for her. She scrolled through David's recent texts, looking for clues she'd been too trusting to notice before. Business trips that seemed to happen every weekend. Client dinners that ran impossibly late. Conference calls that required him to take his phone into the bathroom for privacy. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. Her husband of 8 years, the father of her unborn child, was having an affair with her former best friend. And based on Brooke's text about celebrating their news, this wasn't just a casual fling. Sarah's hands shook as she opened her banking app. Their joint account showed the usual deposits from David's company, but new withdrawals caught her attention. $15,000 to Tiffany just last week, another $8,000 to a luxury resort in Carmel, $5,000 to a high-end maternity boutique that definitely wasn't where Sarah shopped. The mathematical precision of betrayal laid bare in digits and decimal points. She thought back to their wedding day, 8 years ago in the botanical gardens of Golden Gate Park. David in his perfectly tailored tuxedo, tears in his eyes as he recited vows he'd written himself. In wealth and in poverty, in sickness and in health, in your success and in mine, I promise to be your partner in all things. Partnership. What a joke. Sarah had been the silent partner who'd given up her equity in her own life. Her pregnancy had been a celebration just 6 months ago. David had picked her up and spun her around their marble kitchen island when she'd shown him the positive test. He'd immediately started planning the nursery, talking about family values and legacy. It was David who'd suggested she stop her part-time consulting work to focus entirely on the pregnancy. I want you to have every advantage, he'd said, his hands on her still flat belly. The best doctors, the best nutrition, no stress. Our baby deserves a mother who can dedicate herself completely to her health. Now she understood. A pregnant wife was harder to divorce. A pregnant wife garnered sympathy in court proceedings. A pregnant wife made him look stable and family-oriented to investors and business partners. She wasn't carrying his child, she was carrying his insurance policy. Sarah's phone rang, startling her from her dark thoughts. David's face filled the screen. His LinkedIn headshot smile that she'd once found charming, but now seemed calculating. Hi, sweetheart. His familiar voice filled the car through the Bluetooth system. I'm so sorry I missed the appointment. How's our girl doing? Perfect. Sarah managed, her voice steadier than she felt. 24 weeks, healthy heartbeat, everything on track. That's my strong woman, David said, and Sarah could hear the satisfaction in his voice. Listen, I have some bad news. I need to fly to Napa tomorrow for that vineyard acquisition meeting. It might run through the weekend. The vineyard, where he was meeting Brooke, where they had a suite reserved for celebrating their news. Oh, Sarah said carefully, that's a shame. I was hoping we could start looking at cribs this weekend. Rain check. David's tone was distracted now, probably already mentally checking out of the conversation. This deal could be huge for the company. You understand? She understood perfectly now. Of course, Sarah said. Business comes first. You're amazing, Sarah. I love you. The words felt hollow, rehearsed. How many times had he said those same words to Brooke after hanging up? Sarah sat in the silence of her car, rain continuing its relentless percussion on the roof. She thought about the life she'd built, or thought she'd built, the sacrifices she'd made for his dreams, the career opportunities she'd turned down, the friends she'd lost touch with because David's social circle became her world. But mostly, she thought about the folder in David's home office labeled personal legal documents. She'd seen it once while looking for birth certificates for a passport application. Inside, she'd glimpsed the corner of their prenuptial agreement, the document she'd signed 8 years ago when she was madly in love, and David was just a startup founder with big dreams and bigger debts. That prenup heavily favored David, written when he had nothing and she was the one with the steady income. Now, with his company worth $50 million and her net worth consisting mainly of joint assets she had no legal claim to, that document represented her potential financial destruction. Sarah started the car and drove home through the Seattle rain, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. She'd spent 8 years building David's empire. Now it was time to figure out how to claim her share. The glass mansion felt different when she walked through the front door. The soaring ceilings and floor-to-ceiling windows that had once felt luxurious now seemed like a transparent prison. Every expensive piece of art, every designer piece of furniture, every carefully curated detail of their perfect life mocked her. In David's study, she found what she was looking for. The hotel receipt from the Auberge du Soleil in Napa Valley, dated just 2 weeks ago. Presidential suite, 2 guests, 3 nights. The same weekend, David had told her he was in Portland meeting with potential investors. Sarah photographed the receipt with her phone, her hands steadier now that she had evidence. This was just the beginning. If David thought he could discard her like an outdated business plan, he was about to learn that his wife had learned a few things about strategy during their marriage. As she prepared for bed that night, Sarah caught sight of herself in their bathroom mirror. Her dark hair was pulled back in a simple ponytail, her face free of makeup, her body changing with pregnancy in ways that made her feel foreign to herself. For years, she'd been the perfect accessory to David's success story. Beautiful, supportive, never threatening his spotlight. But looking at her reflection now, Sarah saw something different. She saw a woman who'd been underestimated, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to fight for. Her phone buzzed with another text. This one was from Brooke. "Can't wait to see you soon. David says the baby is doing well. So happy for you both." The casual cruelty of the message, the fake friendship layered over stolen intimacy, crystallized Sarah's resolve. Brooke Palmer had no idea what she just unleashed. Sarah deleted the message and began making a mental list. She would need a lawyer, preferably one who specialized in high net worth divorces. She would need a private investigator to document the affair properly. She would need to understand exactly what assets David had hidden and where. Most importantly, she would need to be very, very careful. David was smart, ruthless when he needed to be, and had resources she could only imagine. But he had one fatal flaw: he'd underestimated the woman he'd married. Sarah placed her hands on her belly, feeling the flutter of movement from her daughter. "Don't worry, little one," she whispered. "Mama's going to make sure you're taken care of, and that your father learns that some business deals come with consequences he never saw coming." Outside, the Seattle rain continued to fall, washing the city clean for a new day. Inside the glass mansion, Sarah Mitchell began planning the most important campaign of her life, taking down the empire she'd helped build, one strategic move at a time. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, the rain having washed away the previous day's gray clouds. Sarah woke to find David already gone, his side of their California king bed cold and empty. A note on his pillow read, "Early flight to Napa, back Sunday night. Love you. Love you." Two words that had once filled her with warmth now felt like a business signature at the bottom of a termination letter. Sarah made herself breakfast in their gleaming kitchen, the kind of space that belonged in Architectural Digest. Carrara marble countertops, custom German appliances, a view of Lake Washington that real estate agents called priceless. She'd once loved this kitchen, had spent hours planning elaborate dinner parties here when David was building his company and needed to impress investors. Now it felt like a beautiful cage. While sipping her pregnancy-safe herbal tea, Sarah opened her laptop and began researching divorce attorneys. She needed someone who specialized in tech industry divorces, someone who understood how startup founders hid assets in shell companies and cryptocurrency wallets, someone who wouldn't be impressed by David's charm or intimidated by his legal team. Elena Rodriguez's name appeared repeatedly in her searches. A former prosecutor turned divorce attorney, Rodriguez had a reputation for representing wives of high-net-worth individuals. Her website featured testimonials from women who'd successfully challenged seemingly ironclad prenups and recovered millions in hidden assets. "Don't just survive your divorce," Rodriguez's bio read, "emerge stronger, financially secure, and ready to reclaim your life." Sarah scheduled a consultation for Monday, using her maiden name to maintain privacy. Next, she needed documentation. If David was having an affair with Brooke, there would be evidence beyond that single text message. Sarah had learned enough about digital forensics from living with a tech CEO to know that people were rarely as careful as they thought they were. She started with social media. Brooke's Instagram account was set to public, probably for networking purposes. Sarah scrolled through months of posts, looking for patterns. There were the obvious ones: expensive dinners at restaurants Sarah recognized as David's favorites, designer clothes that seemed far beyond a head of marketing salary, vacation photos from destinations David had business trips to, but it was the subtle details that told the real story. A photo of Brooke's hand holding a wine glass, with a man's watch visible in the background. Sarah recognized that watch, a limited edition Rolex she'd given David for their 5th anniversary. Another photo of Brooke at a jazz club, with the reflection in her wine glass showing a man who looked suspiciously like David. Sarah screenshot everything, building a digital trail of evidence. Her marketing background proved useful here. She understood how to construct a narrative from disparate pieces of content. While investigating, Sarah's phone rang. It was her mother. "Hi, Mom," Sarah answered, trying to keep her voice light. "Sarah, how did your appointment go yesterday? Is everything okay with the baby?" For a moment, Sarah considered telling her mother everything. Barbara Chen had never fully trusted David, though she'd been too polite to say so directly. But Sarah wasn't ready for that conversation yet, not until she had a plan. "Everything's perfect," Sarah said. "Baby girl is healthy and growing right on schedule." "That's wonderful news. And how are you feeling? You sounded a little stressed when we talked last week." Her mother's intuition was as sharp as ever. Barbara Chen hadn't raised two successful daughters by missing emotional cues. "Just the usual pregnancy fatigue," Sarah lied. "David's been traveling a lot for work, so I'm managing most things on my own." "Hmm." The disapproval in her mother's voice was subtle but clear. "Well, you know your father and I are here if you need anything. You don't have to handle everything alone, sweetheart." After hanging up, Sarah felt a pang of longing for the simplicity of her childhood home in Sacramento. Her parents had built a solid, middle-class life based on mutual respect and shared sacrifice. Her father had taught high school mathematics for 35 years, while her mother ran a small accounting firm. They'd never been wealthy, but they'd been partners in the truest sense. Sarah pushed away the nostalgia and returned to her investigation. She called a private detective agency that specialized in marital investigations, using the same careful language she'd once used in marketing campaigns to suggest rather than state directly. "I need help documenting my husband's business activities," she told the investigator, Marcus Webb. "I'm concerned about some financial irregularities that might affect our family's security." Webb was professional and discreet. He could begin surveillance immediately, he told her, and would provide a comprehensive report within a week. The cost was substantial, but Sarah had access to a personal credit card that David rarely monitored. "One thing," Webb added before hanging up, "if this involves documenting infidelity, the evidence is much stronger when we can show a pattern of behavior rather than isolated incidents. Time is your friend here." Time. Sarah placed her hand on her belly, feeling the baby's movements. She had roughly 3 months before her daughter arrived. 3 months to build an airtight case. 3 months to understand exactly what she was entitled to and how to get it. That afternoon, David called from Napa. "Hey, beautiful," he said, his voice warm and relaxed. "How's your day been?" "Quiet," Sarah replied. "Just resting and catching up on some reading. That's my girl, taking care of yourself and our baby." In the background, Sarah could hear classical music and the clink of wine glasses. David was at lunch somewhere expensive, somewhere romantic. "How's the vineyard acquisition going?" she asked, testing him. "Complicated," David said quickly. "Lots of moving parts. The owner is being difficult about the valuation. I'm sure you'll work it out. You always do." "That's why I married you," David said with a laugh. "You believe in me even when deals get tough." The casualness of his lie was almost impressive. Sarah wondered if Brooke was sitting across from him right now, listening to him lie to his pregnant wife with the same charming confidence he used in boardrooms. "I should let you get back to your meeting," Sarah said. "I love you." "Love you too, babe." "I'll try to call tomorrow." After hanging up, Sarah sat in the silence of their home and realized she felt nothing. No pain, no anger, no sadness. Just a cold, clear determination to understand exactly what her marriage was worth and how to claim her fair share. That evening, she ordered Thai food and settled in to review David's company's public filings. As a privately held startup, Mitchell AI didn't release much financial information, but there were clues in industry publications and investor announcements. Sarah discovered that David's company had raised $60 million in Series C funding just 6 months ago, valuing the company at $200 million, not the $50 million David had mentioned to her. The lead investor was a venture capital firm known for backing artificial intelligence startups that were preparing for IPO. More interesting was a press release announcing Brooke Palmer's promotion to Chief Marketing Officer. a position that came with significant equity compensation. Sarah had helped David understand equity compensation when his company was just getting started. She knew those packages were structured to reward loyalty and results. She wondered what kind of results Brooke was delivering to earn such a generous package. Sarah's investigation was interrupted by a text message from an unknown number. "Hi, Sarah. This is Elena Rodriguez's office. We had to reschedule some appointments and have an opening tomorrow at 2 p.m. if you're available. Would you prefer to meet sooner rather than Monday?" Perfect. Sarah confirmed the appointment and spent the rest of the evening preparing for the most important meeting of her life. She gathered every financial document she could find: tax returns, bank statements, investment account summaries, insurance policies, and the prenuptial agreement she'd naively signed 8 years ago. She made copies of everything and stored the originals in a safety deposit box at a bank where David didn't have accounts. Before bed, Sarah allowed herself one moment of vulnerability. She looked at their wedding photos, displayed in expensive frames throughout their bedroom. In every picture, she looked radiant, completely in love, trusting completely in their future together. David looked handsome and confident, but now Sarah noticed something she'd missed before. Even on their wedding day, his smile never quite reached his eyes when he looked at her. His most genuine expressions were reserved for the camera, for the audience, for anyone except his bride. Sarah had married a performance, not a person. She put the photos away and began preparing for war. Elena Rodriguez's office occupied the top floor of a downtown Seattle high-rise, with floor-to-ceiling windows offering a commanding view of Elliott Bay. The space was elegant, but not ostentatious, dark wood furniture, carefully chosen art pieces, and an overall atmosphere that suggested both competence and discretion. Sarah arrived 15 minutes early, wearing her most conservative maternity dress and carrying a leather portfolio that contained 8 years of financial documentation. She felt exposed and vulnerable, but also determined. Elena Rodriguez was not what Sarah had expected. Mid-40s, with silver-streaked hair pulled back in a sleek chignon, she moved with the confident grace of someone who'd never lost a battle she'd chosen to fight. Her handshake was firm, her smile warm but professional. "Mrs. Mitchell," Elena said, gesturing to a comfortable chair across from her desk. "I appreciate you coming in on short notice. How can I help you?" Sarah had rehearsed this moment, but sitting across from this formidable woman, she found herself struggling for words. Finally, she simply handed Elena her phone with Brooke's text message displayed. Elena read it carefully, her expression neutral. "How long have you suspected your husband was having an affair?" "I discovered this yesterday," Sarah said. "But looking back, probably for months, maybe longer." And the woman mentioned in this text, Brooke Palmer, she was my best friend in college. David hired her 3 years ago as a marketing director. She was recently promoted to chief marketing officer. Elena made notes on a legal pad. "Tell me about your financial situation." For the next hour, Sarah outlined everything she knew about David's company, their joint assets, and the prenuptial agreement that had seemed like a formality 8 years ago. Elena listened without interruption, occasionally asking for clarification or making additional notes. "The prenup is problematic," Elena said finally, "but not insurmountable. If we can prove that David misrepresented his assets or prospects when you signed it, we may be able to challenge its validity." "What do you mean?" 8 years ago, when you signed this agreement, David represented himself as a startup founder with minimal assets and significant debt. "Is that accurate?" Sarah nodded. "He was living in a studio apartment and driving a 10-year-old Honda. I was the one with a steady income and savings. But now his company is valued at $200 million, not $50 million as he's told you. If we can prove he was already planning strategies to undervalue the company or hide assets when you signed the prenup, that could constitute fraud." The possibility sent a surge of hope through Sarah's chest. "How do we prove that?" "We start with a forensic accountant and a private investigator. We need to understand exactly what David owns, where it's held, and how he structured his assets. We also need to document this affair thoroughly, because infidelity can impact asset division in Washington state under certain circumstances. Elena pulled out a different folder. I'm going to give you some homework. I need you to gather every financial document you can find. Bank statements, tax returns, business filings, investment accounts, insurance policies, credit card statements. If David has a home office, I need you to photograph any documents you can access legally. Legally, you have every right to access financial information about assets that are marital property. But we need to be careful about how we obtain evidence. Everything we do needs to be admissible in court. Sarah left Elena's office with a list of tasks and a retainer agreement for $50,000. It was a substantial sum, but Elena had been clear high net worth divorces required significant upfront investment to level the playing field. That evening, while David was still in Napa with Brooke, Sarah began her homework. She started in David's home office, a minimalist space with a standing desk, multiple monitors, and a wall safe she'd never seen him open. In his desk drawers, she found business cards for financial advisors she'd never heard of, handwritten notes about offshore optimization strategies, and a small notebook filled with what appeared to be cryptocurrency wallet addresses and passwords. Sarah photographed everything, being careful to return each item exactly where she'd found it. Her marketing background had taught her to be detail-oriented, and now that skill was serving her in an entirely different context. The most interesting discovery was a manila folder labeled Personal Investment Strategy. Inside were documents related to real estate purchases in the Cayman Islands, a Swiss bank account, and investment accounts held under the name of a shell company called Cascade Holdings LLC. Sarah had never heard of Cascade Holdings, but the documentation showed that David was the sole owner and that the company held assets worth nearly $20 million. $20 million that wasn't listed on any of the financial disclosures he'd shared with her. She photographed every page, her hands shaking slightly as the magnitude of David's deception became clear. He hadn't just hidden an affair, he'd hidden a fortune. That night, alone in their bedroom, Sarah felt the baby kicking vigorously. The movements were stronger now, more insistent, as if her daughter could sense the tension and uncertainty surrounding her arrival. I'm going to take care of us, Sarah whispered, her hands on her belly. Your father thinks he can walk away from his responsibilities, but he's about to learn that actions have consequences. Her phone buzzed with a text from David. Missing you and our girl. Can't wait to be home Sunday and hold you both. The hypocrisy was staggering. Sarah wondered if he'd sent a similar message to Brooke, substituting different endearments but using the same emotional manipulation. She didn't respond to the text. Sunday evening, David returned home with expensive wine and exotic cheeses from Napa Valley. He seemed relaxed and happy, humming while he unpacked his suitcase. Sarah watched him from the bedroom doorway, studying the man she'd thought she'd known for 8 years. How was your trip? She asked. Productive, David said, hanging up a new silk tie she didn't recognize. The vineyard deal is moving forward, and we identified some interesting partnership opportunities. Partnership opportunities. Wine industry meets tech industry. There's a lot of potential for data analytics in agriculture. David's lies came so easily, delivered with the same confident tone he used when pitching investors. Sarah wondered if he'd always been this skilled at deception, or if the success of his company had simply given him more opportunities to practice. That sounds exciting, Sarah said. I missed you. David crossed the room and kissed her forehead, his hands resting on her belly. I missed you too. How's our little princess doing? Active, Sarah said. I think she's going to be strong-willed. Just like her mother, David said with a smile that might have been genuine or might have been another performance. That night, as David slept beside her, Sarah lay awake planning her next moves. Elena had given her the name of a private investigator who specialized in documenting extramarital affairs. Sarah had also scheduled an appointment with a forensic accountant who could help trace David's hidden assets. But beyond the practical steps, Sarah was beginning to understand something more fundamental. Her marriage hadn't just ended when David began his affair with Brooke. It had probably never really existed in the first place. She'd fallen in love with David's potential, his dreams, his vision of their future together. But David had fallen in love with what Sarah could do for him, her marketing expertise, her emotional support, her willingness to sacrifice her own ambitions for his success. Now that he no longer needed those things, or thought he didn't, Sarah had become expendable. The irony was that David had underestimated what he'd taught her during their marriage. 8 years of watching him build a company had given Sarah an education in business strategy, negotiation, and the art of the deal. Now she was going to use that education against him. As dawn broke over Lake Washington, Sarah made a decision. She wasn't just going to divorce David. She was going to dismantle the empire she'd helped him build, piece by carefully documented piece. The war was just beginning. The private investigator's report arrived by encrypted email exactly 1 week later, while David was in his home office conducting a video conference with investors in Tokyo. Sarah read the 23-page document in their kitchen, her coffee growing cold as the evidence of her husband's double life unfolded in meticulous detail. Marcus Webb had been thorough. The report included photographs of David and Brooke entering and leaving high-end hotels, receipts for romantic dinners charged to company credit cards, and phone records showing hundreds of calls and text messages between them dating back 18 months. But the most damning evidence was financial. Webb had traced payments from David's personal accounts to cover Brooke's rent on a luxury downtown condo, her car payments on a BMW convertible, and shopping sprees at high-end boutiques. The total expenditure on his mistress exceeded $200,000 over the past year alone. $200,000 of marital assets spent on maintaining an affair. Sarah felt sick, but not from the pregnancy. The casual way David had spent their money on another woman while lecturing Sarah about being financially responsible felt like a violation beyond the affair itself. The report also included screenshots from Brooke's private social media accounts, obtained through methods Sarah didn't want to know about. The posts told a story of a woman living far beyond her official means, traveling to exotic destinations and wearing designer clothes that would have consumed her entire salary. In one particularly galling photo, Brooke wore the Tiffany necklace that had appeared on their credit card statement. The caption read, "When your man knows exactly what makes you feel special." Sarah's hands shook as she forwarded the report to Elena Rodriguez. Within an hour, her phone rang. "This is excellent work," Elena said without preamble. "We have enough evidence to prove adultery and the dissipation of marital assets. How are you feeling?" "Angry," Sarah said honestly. "And scared." "Good. Anger will serve you well in what's coming next. I'm going to file for legal separation this week, with a motion for temporary spousal support and exclusive use of the marital home. Will that work? David's going to fight us every step of the way. Men like your husband don't give up their advantages easily, but we have something he doesn't expect: the truth. Thoroughly documented." That afternoon, while David was still in his video conference, Sarah received a text from Brooke. "Hope you're feeling well. David mentioned you've been tired lately. Pregnancy can be so draining." The false concern in the message was infuriating. Sarah stared at her phone, composing and deleting several responses. Finally, she settled on something that would plant a seed of doubt without revealing her knowledge. "Thanks for thinking of me. David's been so supportive. He tells me everything. You know, we have no secrets between us." Brooke's response came quickly. "That's so sweet. You're lucky to have such an honest husband." The irony was apparently lost on her. 2 days later, the process server arrived at David's office. Sarah knew because she received a furious phone call less than an hour after the legal separation papers were delivered. "What the hell is this?" "Sarah!" David's voice was tight with controlled rage. "Legal separation? Are you out of your mind?" "I think I'm finally thinking clearly," Sarah replied, surprised by how calm she sounded. "This is insane. You're 6 months pregnant. You can't handle the stress of a legal battle." "I'm handling it fine so far. Sarah, whatever's going on with you, we can work it out. But this legal nonsense has to stop. Call your lawyer and withdraw the papers." "No." The single word hung in the air between them. Sarah had never simply refused David anything before. She'd always negotiated, compromised, found ways to give him what he wanted while preserving some version of what she needed. No, David's voice rose. Sarah, be reasonable. You're not thinking straight. Pregnancy hormones can cause. Don't, Sarah interrupted. Don't you dare blame my decision-making on pregnancy hormones. I'm thinking more clearly than I have in years. Fine, we'll talk about this when I get home. But David didn't come home that night, or the next night. Sarah learned from the private investigator's updated reports that he was staying at Brooks' downtown condo, apparently having decided that maintaining his facade was no longer necessary. The abandonment was actually helpful. Elena filed an emergency motion claiming that David had abandoned his pregnant wife, seeking an immediate court order for spousal support and exclusive possession of the marital home. He's making our case for us, Elena explained during their morning phone call. A judge is going to look very unfavorably on a man who leaves his pregnant wife to move in with his mistress. But David wasn't finished making tactical errors. On Thursday morning, Sarah discovered that he'd frozen their joint bank accounts and canceled her credit cards. She learned this when her pregnancy vitamins were declined at the pharmacy. The humiliation was deliberate and calculated. David was trying to force her back into dependence, to make her realize how precarious her financial position was without his goodwill. Instead, he just provided Elena with additional evidence of financial abuse. This is perfect, Elena said when Sarah called from the pharmacy parking lot. We're filing an emergency motion this afternoon. No judge is going to let a millionaire cut off his pregnant wife's access to funds for basic necessities. That evening, alone in the glass mansion that no longer felt like home, Sarah received an unexpected visitor. David's mother, Patricia Mitchell, stood at the front door looking elegant and disapproving in equal measure. Patricia had never liked Sarah, though she'd been too well-bred to say so directly. She'd made her feelings clear through subtle slights, gifts that were slightly too small, compliments that carried backhanded critiques, suggestions that David might have been happier with someone more suited to his social circle. Sarah, dear, Patricia said, air kissing her cheek. I hope you don't mind me dropping by. I wanted to check on you. That's thoughtful of you, Sarah replied, though she doubted Patricia's motives were purely maternal. They sat in the living room, Patricia perched elegantly on the edge of a white leather chair, while Sarah sank into the comfortable sofa that better accommodated her pregnant body. I understand you're going through a difficult time, Patricia began. Marriage can be challenging, especially when there are outside pressures. Outside pressures? David's company is at a critical stage. Investors are demanding. The competition is fierce. Sometimes successful men make mistakes when they're under tremendous stress. Sarah studied her mother-in-law's carefully composed face. What kind of mistakes are we talking about? I think you know, dear, but mistakes can be forgiven, especially when there's so much at stake, for everyone involved. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Patricia delicately suggesting that Sarah was being unreasonable, that divorce would hurt everyone, especially the baby, and that successful marriages required certain accommodations. It was only after Patricia left that Sarah realized she'd been offered a bribe. Not explicitly, but the implication was clear: overlook David's affair, accept a more generous financial settlement, and preserve the family's reputation. The offer told Sarah everything she needed to know about how the Mitchell family viewed her as a problem to be managed, not a person who'd been wronged. That night, Sarah called her own mother. How are you holding up, sweetheart? Barbara Chen's voice was warm with concern. I'm stronger than I thought I'd be, Sarah said, and realized it was true. Your father and I have been worried. We know you must be going through something significant, even though you haven't told us what. Sarah took a deep breath. David's having an affair. I filed for legal separation. The silence on the other end of the line stretched for nearly a minute. How long have you known? Her mother finally asked. About a week. And how long has it been going on? At least 18 months, probably longer. Another pause. What do you need from us? The simple question, free of judgment or demands for explanation, brought tears to Sarah's eyes. I need to know that I'm doing the right thing. You're protecting yourself and your daughter, Barbara said firmly. That's always the right thing. After hanging up, Sarah felt more alone than ever, but also more determined. She had allies now: Elena, the private investigator, the forensic accountant who was tracing David's hidden assets, and most importantly, her own family. David had Brooke, his mother, and his legal team. But Sarah had something more valuable: the truth and the documentation to prove it. The real battle was just beginning. The courtroom felt like a theater designed for tragedy. High ceilings, dark wood paneling, and an atmosphere thick with the weight of broken promises and shattered dreams. Sarah sat beside Elena at the plaintiff's table, her hands folded over her 7-month pregnant belly, trying to project calm confidence while her heart raced. Across the aisle, David sat with his legal team, 3 attorneys from Seattle's most prestigious family law firm, all wearing identical expressions of professional disdain. David himself looked polished and successful in a custom-tailored Navy suit, his expression carefully composed to suggest a reasonable man dealing with an unreasonable situation. Judge Margaret Harrison presided over the hearing with the brisk efficiency of someone who'd seen every variation of marital betrayal. She was known for her no-nonsense approach and her particular intolerance for men who abandon pregnant wives. This is a hearing on the plaintiff's motion for temporary spousal support and exclusive possession of the marital home. Judge Harrison began. Counsel for the plaintiff, you may proceed. Elena stood gracefully, her silver hair catching the courtroom lights. Your Honor, we're dealing with a case of systematic financial abuse and marital abandonment. Mr. Mitchell, upon being served with separation papers, immediately froze all joint accounts and canceled his wife's credit cards, leaving her without access to funds for basic necessities, including prenatal care. She gestured toward Sarah. Mrs. Mitchell is 7 months pregnant with their first child. She gave up her career at her husband's request to focus on supporting his business endeavors. She is now entirely dependent on spousal support to maintain her health and prepare for their daughter's arrival. David's lead attorney, Jonathan Pierce, was a man who'd built his reputation defending wealthy husbands in high-profile divorces. He stood with the confident bearing of someone accustomed to winning. Your Honor, Mr. Mitchell denies any wrongdoing in this marriage. He's provided generously for his wife throughout their 8-year marriage, giving her a lifestyle most women would envy. The freezing of accounts was a temporary measure to prevent the dissipation of marital assets while this matter is resolved. Judge Harrison looked skeptical. Mr. Pierce, your client moved out of the marital home and is currently residing with another woman. How does that support a claim of preserving the marriage? Mr. Mitchell has been staying with a colleague while this emotionally charged situation cools down. He remains committed to his wife and unborn child. Sarah felt sick listening to the casual lies being presented as fact, but Elena was prepared. Your Honor, I'd like to submit evidence that Mr. Mitchell's colleague is actually his mistress of at least 18 months, and that he spent over $200,000 of marital assets maintaining this relationship. Elena presented photographs from the private investigator's report: David and Brooke entering hotels, dining at romantic restaurants, shopping together for expensive jewelry. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Judge Harrison examined the photographs with growing disapproval. Mr. Pierce, would you like to revise your client's statement about the nature of his relationship with Ms. Palmer? Pierce huddled briefly with David, whose composed facade was finally showing cracks. Your Honor, my client acknowledges that he's developed feelings for Ms. Palmer, but this relationship began after the marriage was effectively over. When did the marriage become effectively over? The judge asked pointedly. When Mrs. Mitchell became emotionally unstable due to her pregnancy. She's been making unreasonable demands and creating a hostile home environment. Sarah's hands clenched involuntarily. Elena placed a calming hand on her arm. Your Honor, Elena said, we'd like to call Mrs. Mitchell to testify about these alleged unreasonable demands and hostile behavior. Sarah stood slowly, her pregnant body feeling unwieldy in the formal courtroom setting. The witness stand seemed impossibly far away, but she made it there with careful steps. After being sworn in, Elena guided her through basic questions about their marriage, her sacrifices for David's career, and her recent discovery of the affair. Mrs. Mitchell, can you describe your husband's behavior when you confronted him about the evidence of his infidelity? He didn't deny it, Sarah said, her voice steady despite her nerves. He said we could work it out, but only if I called off the legal proceedings. When I refused, he abandoned our home and cut off my access to all financial resources, including resources for prenatal care. Yes, I discovered the credit cards were canceled when my pregnancy vitamins were declined at the pharmacy. A murmur of disapproval rippled through the courtroom gallery, where a few court watchers and law students had gathered to observe the proceedings. Pierce's cross-examination was aggressive but careful. He tried to paint Sarah as a woman who'd married for money, who'd never been satisfied with David's generosity, who was using the pregnancy to manipulate the legal system. Mrs. Mitchell, isn't it true that you signed a prenuptial agreement acknowledging that your husband's business assets would remain separate property? I signed an agreement based on the financial situation as it existed 8 years ago, Sarah replied. I wasn't informed about offshore accounts, shell companies, or the systematic hiding of assets that's occurred since then. You have no proof of hidden assets. Elena stood. Objection, Your Honor. That misstates the evidence already presented. Sustained. Mr. Pierce, please limit your questions to matters in evidence. But Pierce wasn't finished. Mrs. Mitchell, have you ever been treated for depression or other mental health issues? Sarah's breath caught. Elena had warned her this question might come up. I received counseling after a miscarriage 3 years ago. It was grief counseling, recommended by my obstetrician. And during that counseling, were you prescribed antidepressant medication? Briefly, yes. Are you currently taking any psychiatric medication? No. Pierce nodded as if he'd made an important point. No further questions. Elena's redirect was swift and effective. Mrs. Mitchell, the counseling you received after your miscarriage, was that with your husband's knowledge and support? Yes. David insisted I get help. He said we needed to work through the grief together before trying for another child. And the medication prescribed, was that temporary? Yes. I took it for about 3 months while we processed the loss. Have you had any mental health issues since that time? No. My current obstetrician says I'm handling this pregnancy beautifully, both physically and emotionally. When testimony concluded, Judge Harrison didn't need long to deliberate. I'm granting the plaintiff's motion in its entirety, she announced. Mr. Mitchell will pay temporary spousal support of $15,000 per month, backdated to the date the accounts were frozen. Mrs. Mitchell is granted exclusive possession of the marital home pending final resolution of this matter. She fixed David with a stern look. Mr. Mitchell, I find your conduct in this matter reprehensible. Abandoning a pregnant wife to live with your mistress while cutting off her financial support is not the behavior of a responsible husband or father. You will restore Mrs. Mitchell's access to necessary funds immediately. David's face flushed red, but he remained silent as the judge continued. Furthermore, I'm ordering both parties to attend mandatory counseling to determine appropriate arrangements for the minor child upon her birth. Given Mr. Mitchell's demonstrated poor judgment, I have serious concerns about his fitness as a primary caretaker. The hearing ended with David storming out of the courtroom, his legal team scrambling to keep up. Sarah felt simultaneously triumphant and exhausted. That went better than I hoped, Elena said as they gathered their papers. Judge Harrison clearly sees through his lies. But their victory was short-lived. That evening, Sarah discovered that David had been busy behind the scenes. A gossip blog focused on Seattle's tech industry published a lengthy article titled, AI Startup CEO's Messy Divorce, Wife Demands Millions While Husband Builds the Future. The article portrayed Sarah as a gold-digging wife who trapped a successful entrepreneur with an unplanned pregnancy, then demanded an enormous settlement when he tried to end their loveless marriage. Anonymous sources, clearly David or his allies, described Sarah as emotionally unstable, financially irresponsible, and unsuited for motherhood. The comments section was brutal. Hundreds of strangers weighed in on Sarah's character, her motives, and her worthiness as a mother. The anonymity of the internet had unleashed a torrent of misogyny and cruelty that left Sarah shaking with rage and humiliation. Elena called within hours of the article's publication. "This is defamation, and we're going to sue everyone involved. But for now, stay off social media and don't read the comments." Too late for that advice. Sarah had already read every vicious comment, each one feeling like a personal attack on her character and her unborn daughter. That night, alone in the glass mansion that felt more like a fishbowl than ever, Sarah experienced her first panic attack. The combination of stress, exhaustion, and public humiliation overwhelmed her body's ability to cope. She found herself hyperventilating on the bathroom floor, her hands shaking uncontrollably as she struggled to breathe. It was her unborn daughter who brought her back to reality. The baby's strong kicks reminded Sarah that she wasn't fighting just for herself anymore. She was fighting for a little girl who deserved better than a father who would abandon his family for a younger woman. Sarah called her obstetrician's emergency line and was reassured that stress-related panic attacks, while unpleasant, weren't dangerous to the baby. But Dr. Martinez recommended that Sarah consider temporary bed rest if the stress continued to escalate. "Your baby needs you healthy," Dr. Martinez said. "Whatever's happening in your personal life, try to find ways to minimize stress for these final weeks." Sarah laughed bitterly at the suggestion. She was in the middle of a high-profile divorce from a vindictive millionaire who was systematically trying to destroy her reputation. Stress minimization wasn't exactly an option. But that night, lying in the bed she'd once shared with David, Sarah felt something shift inside her. The panic attack had been terrifying, but it had also been clarifying. She couldn't control what David did or what strangers on the internet said about her. She could only control her own actions and her own choices. Sarah decided to stop reading about herself online and start focusing on building the strongest possible case for her daughter's future. David wanted a war, she'd give him one, but she'd fight it on her terms, with her weapons truth, documentation, and the kind of strategic thinking that had once made her a successful marketer. The custody battle was just beginning, and Sarah intended to win. The revelation came at 3 in the morning, delivered through an encrypted message from Marcus Webb, the private investigator. Sarah had been having another sleepless night, her daughter's increasingly vigorous movements making comfortable sleep impossible, when her phone buzzed with an urgent notification. "Need to meet immediately. Discovered something that changes everything. Coffee shop on Pine Street, 7 a.m. Sarah arrived at the small cafe before Webb, choosing a corner table where they could speak privately. The investigator looked like he hadn't slept, his usual professional composure replaced by the excitement of someone who'd stumbled onto something significant. "I've been digging deeper into David's business relationships." Webb began without preamble, sliding a manila folder across the table. "Your husband isn't just hiding assets. He's built his entire company on stolen intellectual property." Sarah opened the folder to find documents that made her head spin: patent applications, employment contracts, and email exchanges that painted a picture of systematic theft and deception. 3 years ago, David hired Dr. Jennifer Wu, a brilliant AI researcher from Stanford. Webb continued. "She brought with her a revolutionary algorithm for natural language processing that she developed during her graduate studies. David promised her equity and recognition. Instead, he patented her work under his own name and fired her 6 months later. That's illegal, isn't it? Highly illegal, but it gets worse. Dr. Wu wasn't the only victim. David has systematically hired top talent, stolen their innovations, and then forced them out of the company through various means. Sexual harassment complaints that were buried, trumped up performance reviews, hostile work environments." Sarah felt sick. She'd been married to a man she didn't know at all. There's more, Webb said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. Brooke Palmer isn't just David's mistress. She's his co-conspirator. She's been using her position in marketing to identify potential targets, researchers whose work could be valuable to the company. The folder contained email exchanges between David and Brooke discussing talent acquisition strategies that were really elaborate schemes to steal intellectual property. Brooke would attend academic conferences, identify promising researchers, and then orchestrate their recruitment to David's company. This is how they met, Webb explained. Brooke approached Dr. Wu at a conference in San Francisco 18 months ago. She convinced Wu to consider joining David's company, then provided inside information about Wu's research that David used to steal her work. Sarah stared at the documents, pieces of a puzzle finally falling into place. My marketing idea, she said slowly. The strategies I developed when David was first starting the company, Brooke has been using them as templates for this scheme. Your ideas 8 years ago, I helped David develop the marketing framework for his startup, customer identification, competitive analysis, target acquisition strategies. I thought we were building a legitimate business together. Webb nodded grimly. Your husband has turned your own work against you, and against every researcher he's victimized. The implications were staggering. David's company wasn't worth $50 million or even $200 million. It was built on a foundation of fraud that could collapse at any moment, taking his wealth and reputation with it. What do we do with this information? Sarah asked. That's up to you and your attorney, but I'd recommend moving quickly. Dr. Wu is filing her own lawsuit against David's company. Once that becomes public, other victims are likely to come forward. Sarah called Elena from the parking lot outside the cafe, her hands shaking as she dialed. This changes everything, Elena said after Sarah summarized Webb's findings. We're not just dealing with a cheating husband anymore. We're dealing with systematic corporate fraud. Can you get me copies of those documents? Webb gave me everything. Good, I'm calling an emergency meeting for this afternoon. We need to decide whether to pursue this as part of the divorce or hand it over to federal prosecutors. What's the difference? If we pursue it as part of the divorce, we might be able to recover more assets for you and your daughter. If we hand it to prosecutors, David goes to prison, but there might not be anything left to divide. The decision felt impossibly complex. Sarah wanted justice for Dr. Wu and the other researchers David had victimized, but she also needed to protect her daughter's financial future. Elena's office that afternoon resembled a war room. The conference table was covered with documents, laptop computers, and legal pads filled with notes. Elena had assembled a team that included the forensic accountant, a white-collar criminal defense attorney, and a technology expert who specialized in intellectual property theft. Here's what we know, Elena began, pointing to a timeline on the whiteboard. David Mitchell has built his company through systematic theft of intellectual property. The true value of his assets is unclear because it's all based on stolen work that could be subject to massive civil judgments. The forensic accountant, a sharp-eyed woman named Dr. Sarah Kim, had been analyzing David's financial records for weeks. The hidden assets we've identified total approximately $40 million across various offshore accounts and shell companies. But if the intellectual property theft is proven, David could face judgments that exceed his entire net worth. What about the criminal exposure? Elena asked the white-collar defense attorney. Significant, he replied. Intellectual property theft, fraud, tax evasion based on these hidden assets. We're looking at potential federal charges that could result in decades in prison. Sarah listened to the discussion with growing amazement. The man she'd been married to for 8 years wasn't just unfaithful. He was a criminal who'd built his empire on the stolen dreams of other people. I want to help Dr. Wu and the others, Sarah said finally. But I also need to protect my daughter. What's the best way to do both? Elena considered the question carefully. We have a narrow window of opportunity. If we move quickly, we can file an emergency motion to freeze all of David's assets before he has a chance to hide them further. Once his assets are frozen, we can negotiate a settlement that provides for you and your daughter, while also ensuring that his victims can recover damages. And David, David is going to face the consequences of his choices. Whether that's prison, bankruptcy, or both depends on how the evidence unfolds. The plan they developed was elegant in its simplicity. Elena would file an emergency motion alleging fraud and seeking to freeze all marital assets. Simultaneously, Webb would provide his evidence to both Dr. Wu's attorneys and federal prosecutors. Sarah would cooperate fully with all investigations, positioning herself as a victim rather than an accomplice. "There's one more thing," Elena said as the meeting concluded. "Brooke Palmer is as culpable as David in this scheme. She's going to face criminal charges of her own. The pregnancy she mentioned in that text message, she's about to have much bigger problems to worry about." That evening, Sarah sat in her nursery, surrounded by baby clothes and furniture that had been purchased with stolen money. The irony wasn't lost on her. She'd been furnishing her daughter's room with the proceeds of her husband's crimes. Her phone rang. David's name appeared on the screen. "Hi," she answered, curious to hear how he would handle their conversation now that she knew the truth about his business. "Sarah, we need to talk. This legal battle is getting out of hand." "Is it?" "The publicity is hurting my company. My investors are getting nervous. We need to find a way to settle this quietly." Sarah almost laughed. David was worried about bad publicity when he was sitting on a criminal enterprise that was about to explode into international headlines. "What kind of settlement are you thinking about?" she asked. "Generous. Very generous. Enough to set you and the baby up for life." "How generous?" $10 million, cash, in exchange for a quick, quiet divorce and a confidentiality agreement. $10 million was more money than Sarah had ever imagined having. It was financial security beyond her wildest dreams. But it was also hush money, an attempt to buy her silence about crimes that had hurt innocent people. "I'll think about it," Sarah said. "Don't think too long. This offer expires soon." After hanging up, Sarah realized that David had just confirmed everything Webb had discovered. A man with nothing to hide doesn't offer $10 million for silence. She called Elena immediately. "He's panicking," Elena said with satisfaction. "File that under evidence of consciousness of guilt. When someone offers that kind of money for a confidentiality agreement, they're essentially admitting they have something to hide." "Should I accept it?" "Sarah, if David's company is really worth $200 million and he's offering you $10 million to disappear quietly, he's still planning to steal from you. We're going to get you a fair share of legitimate assets while ensuring he faces justice for his crimes." That night, for the first time in weeks, Sarah slept soundly. She was no longer fighting just for herself or even just for her daughter. She was fighting for every researcher whose work had been stolen, every dreamer whose innovations had been hijacked by a charming sociopath who happened to be her husband. The war was escalating, but Sarah was no longer afraid of the battle ahead. She had something David had never expected: the truth and the determination to see justice done. The FBI raid on David's headquarters began at dawn on a Tuesday morning in early October. Sarah watched the news coverage from her living room, her 8-month pregnant belly making it difficult to sit comfortably as federal agents carried boxes of evidence from the gleaming downtown tower that housed Mitchell AI. The lead story on every local news channel showed David being escorted from the building in handcuffs, his perfectly styled hair disheveled, his expression a mixture of rage and disbelief. The man who'd built his reputation on being 2 steps ahead of everyone else had been caught completely off guard. Federal agents today arrested David Mitchell, CEO of artificial intelligence startup Mitchell AI, on charges of intellectual property theft, wire fraud, and tax evasion. The news anchor reported, "The investigation began when Dr. Jennifer Wu filed a civil lawsuit alleging that Mitchell had stolen her proprietary research and used it to build his company's core technology." Sarah's phone had been ringing constantly since the news broke. Reporters wanting statements, friends and family checking on her well-being, and her legal team coordinating strategy. She'd turned off all notifications except for calls from Elena Rodriguez. "This is exactly what we hoped for," Elena said during their morning call. David's assets are frozen pending the federal investigation. He can't hide anything else, and he can't manipulate the legal system to his advantage. What happens now? Now we wait and watch David's empire collapse in real time. Then we pick up the pieces that legitimately belong to you and your daughter. The collapse was swift and spectacular. By noon, Mitchell AI's board of directors had voted to suspend David as CEO pending the outcome of the criminal investigation. By evening, three major investors had filed lawsuits seeking to recover their investments. By the end of the week, the company's valuation had dropped from $200 million to essentially zero. The tech blogs that had once praised David as a visionary were now calling him a fraud and a thief. The same publications that had recently attacked Sarah were suddenly portraying her as a victim who'd been deceived along with everyone else. Brooke Palmer was arrested on Thursday morning at her downtown condo. The news footage showed her being led away in handcuffs, her usual polished appearance replaced by pajamas and an expression of absolute terror. The charges against her included conspiracy to commit wire fraud, money laundering, and racketeering. Sarah felt no satisfaction watching Brooke's arrest. If anything, she felt sad for the woman she'd once considered a friend. Brooke had destroyed her own life for a man who was now facing decades in federal prison. The personal cost of the scandal was immediate and devastating. Sarah's phone buzzed constantly with calls from reporters, lawyers representing David's victims, and curiosity seekers who'd somehow obtained her number. She was forced to hire a security service after photographers began camping outside her home. The stress was taking a physical toll. Sarah's blood pressure had spiked, causing her obstetrician to order bed rest for the remainder of her pregnancy. Dr. Martinez was concerned about preeclampsia and wanted to monitor Sarah closely as her due date approached. "Your body is telling you to slow down," Dr. Martinez explained during Sarah's weekly appointment. "The baby is healthy, but you need to minimize stress for both your sakes." Easier said than done when your husband's criminal empire was collapsing on national television. Sarah's parents arrived from Sacramento that weekend, her mother immediately taking charge of household management while her father dealt with the media circus outside their home. "We should have known something was wrong," her mother said as they sat together in the nursery, putting finishing touches on preparations for the baby's arrival. "No one builds that kind of wealth that quickly without cutting corners somewhere." "I trusted him," Sarah said simply. "I believed in his vision, his integrity, his love for me." "Trust isn't a weakness, sweetheart. His betrayal is a reflection of his character, not yours." Barbara Chen had retired early from her accounting practice to help Sarah through the final weeks of pregnancy and the early months of motherhood. Having her mother's practical support and emotional strength nearby felt like a lifeline during the chaos. The full scope of David's criminal enterprise became clearer as federal prosecutors filed additional charges. Webb's investigation had uncovered a pattern of systematic theft that extended back to the very founding of Mitchell AI. David had stolen not just Dr. Wu's research, but innovations from more than a dozen researchers over the course of 5 years. The victims began coming forward publicly, sharing stories of how David had manipulated them, stolen their work, and then destroyed their careers when they tried to fight back. Dr. Wu's case was just the tip of an iceberg that included sexual harassment, wrongful termination, and corporate espionage on an international scale. Elena's strategy proved prescient. By positioning Sarah as another victim of David's deception, rather than a knowing beneficiary of his crimes, she'd protected Sarah from criminal liability while preserving her claim to legitimate marital assets. "The prenup is completely void now," Elena explained during one of their regular strategy sessions. "David misrepresented his assets and income when you signed it. More importantly, you can't be bound by an agreement that was designed to hide the proceeds of criminal activity." Kin. The forensic accountant had identified approximately $12 million in assets that predated David's criminal enterprise, the original investment in their home, legitimate early profits from the company, and inheritance money from David's grandparents. These assets would likely survive the federal asset forfeiture proceedings and could be subject to division in the divorce. It's not the $50 million you might have been entitled to if his company had been legitimate. Elena said, but it's enough to ensure financial security for you and your daughter. More importantly to Sarah, the victims of David's crimes were finally getting justice. Dr. Wu's lawsuit had triggered an avalanche of legal action that would eventually result in compensation for everyone David had wronged. The researchers whose work had been stolen would have their innovations returned to them, along with damages for the profits David had earned from their ideas. Sarah found herself thinking often about the irony of her situation. She'd sacrificed her own career to support David's success, only to discover that his success was built on destroying other people's careers. Her marketing strategies had been perverted into tools for identifying and victimizing brilliant researchers. But there was also a strange sense of vindication in watching David's empire crumble. For years, she'd felt like a failure for giving up her own ambitions. Now she understood that she hadn't failed. She'd been systematically manipulated by someone who'd never deserved her sacrifice. The final weeks of her pregnancy passed in a blur of legal meetings, media attention, and physical discomfort. Sarah's world had contracted to the nursery where she spent most of her days, preparing for her daughter's arrival, while her husband's crimes dominated national headlines. David made several attempts to contact her from jail, but Sarah refused all calls. Elena handled all communication through the legal system, maintaining the fiction that Sarah had been as deceived as everyone else. The truth was more complicated. Sarah had suspected something was wrong with their marriage for months before discovering the affair, but she'd never imagined the depth of David's deception or the scope of his crimes. On Halloween night, exactly 9 months after discovering David's affair, Sarah went into labor. Her parents rushed her to the hospital as federal prosecutors were announcing additional charges against David and Brooke based on evidence found in the raids. As Sarah labored to bring her daughter into the world, the man who'd fathered that daughter was sitting in a federal detention center, facing the possibility of spending the rest of his life in prison. The symmetry wasn't lost on her as David's empire died. Their daughter would be born, one chapter ending as another began. Sarah had started this journey as a betrayed wife seeking a fair divorce. She was ending it as a whistleblower who'd helped expose one of the biggest corporate fraud schemes in tech industry history. Her daughter would be born free from the taint of stolen money and built on the foundation of truth and justice rather than lies and theft. It wasn't the life Sarah had planned, but it was a life she could be proud of. Victoria Rose Mitchell entered the world at 3:47 a.m. on November 1st, weighing 7 pounds and 4 ounces. With her mother's dark hair and what the nurses insisted was her father's determined chin, Sarah held her daughter for the first time while news trucks gathered in the hospital parking lot, drawn by the irresistible story of a child born as her father faced federal charges. "She's perfect," Barbara Chen whispered, tears streaming down her face as she looked at her granddaughter. "Absolutely perfect." Sarah stared at the tiny face, marveling at the perfection of miniature fingers and toes. The way Victoria's eyes seemed to focus on her mother's face with startling intensity. This was what she'd been fighting for, not revenge against David, not financial security for herself, but the chance to give her daughter a life built on truth rather than lies. "What's her full name for the birth certificate?" the nurse asked gently. Sarah had been thinking about this for weeks. "Victoria Rose Chen Mitchell," she said finally. "She'll know where she comes from." The first few days in the hospital passed in a blur of feeding schedules, visitor management, and learning the basics of caring for a newborn. Elena visited daily, coordinating legal strategy around Sarah's recovery needs. The federal prosecutors wanted to interview Sarah about David's business practices, but Elena had negotiated a delay until after Sarah had time to adjust to motherhood. David's trial date has been set for next spring, Elena reported during one of their bedside meetings. The prosecution's case is solid. They have documents, recordings, testimony from multiple victims. His defense team is already floating the possibility of a plea agreement. What kind of plea agreement? 20 to 25 years in federal prison, plus full restitution to victims. It would save the government the cost of a trial and guarantee that David never has the opportunity to hurt anyone else. Sarah adjusted Victoria's position at her breast, still amazed by how natural breastfeeding felt despite all her fears during pregnancy. "What about custody?" A man facing decades in prison doesn't have much leverage in custody negotiations. David's parents have hired their own attorney to seek grandparent visitation rights, but even that will be complicated by the criminal charges. The media attention was intense but manageable. Elena had hired a crisis management firm to handle press inquiries, crafting a narrative that portrayed Sarah as a victim who discovered her husband's crimes at the same time as law enforcement. The story was largely true and had the advantage of being supported by documented evidence. More importantly, public opinion had shifted decisively in Sarah's favor. The same blogs and social media accounts that had attacked her during the early stages of the divorce were now praising her courage in cooperating with federal investigators. Several prominent women's rights organizations had issued statements supporting Sarah's decision to leave an abusive marriage. Sarah's business consulting practice, which she'd started almost as therapy during the divorce proceedings, was suddenly receiving inquiries from potential clients across the country. Women who'd read about her story wanted to work with someone who understood the challenges of rebuilding a career after sacrificing it for a partner's ambitions. "I think you're going to be busier than you expected," Elena said with a smile as she reviewed the stack of business inquiries. "There are a lot of women out there who see themselves in your story." The financial picture was clearer now that federal investigators had completed their asset analysis. David's legitimate assets, those that predated his criminal enterprise, totaled approximately $15 million. Under Washington state's community property laws, Sarah was entitled to half of those assets, plus spousal support and child support. More significantly, Sarah had been designated as a victim in the federal case, making her eligible for restitution payments from the eventual asset forfeiture proceedings. The total amount would depend on how much money federal investigators could recover, but early estimates suggested Sarah might receive additional compensation beyond the divorce settlement. "You'll never be as wealthy as you might have been if David's business had been legitimate," Elena explained, "but you'll have enough to provide excellent security for yourself and Victoria, plus the freedom to build whatever kind of life you want." That freedom felt overwhelming and exciting in equal measure. For 8 years, Sarah's life had been defined by David's needs, David's schedule, David's vision of their future. Now she could make choices based entirely on what was best for herself and her daughter. The first choice was where to live. The glass mansion in Bellevue held too many painful memories and attracted too much unwanted attention. Sarah put it on the market and began looking for something smaller and more private, preferably with a garden where Victoria could play safely as she grew. She found the perfect house in Madison Park, a 1920s craftsman with original hardwood floors, a fireplace in every room, and a backyard filled with fruit trees and flower beds. The house needed updating, but it felt like a home rather than a showcase. "It's beautiful," her mother said as they walked through the empty rooms together, Victoria sleeping peacefully in her carrier. "It feels like a place where you could build a real life." Sarah signed the purchase contract on Victoria's 2-week birthday, using money from the emergency spousal support Elena had secured. The symbolism felt important, her first major decision as a single mother, her first step toward creating a new identity separate from David's shadow. The move happened gradually over the course of December. Sarah took only the items that felt truly hers: books, photographs from before her marriage, kitchen equipment she'd chosen herself, and all of Victoria's new nursery furniture. Everything else stayed with the glass mansion, pieces of a life that had never really belonged to her. David's parents made one attempt to visit Victoria before Sarah moved, arriving unannounced at the hospital during her final day there. Patricia Mitchell looked older and more fragile than Sarah remembered, the stress of her son's criminal charges having taken a visible toll. "We'd like to establish a relationship with our granddaughter," Patricia said stiffly, as if delivering a prepared statement. "Despite everything that's happened, she's still our family." Sarah looked at the woman who'd never accepted her, who'd tried to bribe her into overlooking David's affair, who was now asking for access to the granddaughter whose father was facing decades in prison. "Victoria will know about her father's family when she's old enough to understand," Sarah said carefully. "But right now, I need to focus on keeping her safe and healthy." "David made mistakes," Patricia said, her composure finally cracking. "But he's still her father." David is a criminal who destroyed the lives of innocent people, Sarah replied. That's not a mistake. That's a choice he made repeatedly over the course of years. Patricia left without meeting Victoria, but not before leaving an envelope containing photographs of David as a child and a letter explaining his family history. Sarah put the envelope away for some day, when Victoria was old enough to make her own decisions about her father's legacy. The new house became a sanctuary. Sarah worked from a home office she'd set up in the converted attic, taking consulting calls during Victoria's nap times and working on business proposals in the evenings. Her client base grew steadily as word spread about her expertise in helping women rebuild their careers after major life disruptions. The work was personally fulfilling in ways Sarah hadn't expected. She found herself helping women who'd been through divorces, job losses, health crises, and other major transitions that required reinventing their professional identities. Her own experience had given her insights into the psychological and practical challenges of starting over. You understand what it feels like to lose everything and have to rebuild, one client told her during a video consultation. That's not something you can learn from a textbook. By Victoria's 3-month birthday, Sarah's consulting practice was generating enough income to support their lifestyle without relying entirely on spousal support. The financial independence felt almost as important as the emotional freedom of being away from David's influence. The criminal case continued to unfold with David's legal team fighting a losing battle against overwhelming evidence. Dr. Wu's civil lawsuit had been joined by 11 other researchers, creating a class action that sought hundreds of millions in damages. Brooke Palmer had already accepted a plea agreement in exchange for testimony against David, guaranteeing her cooperation with prosecutors. David's going to prison, Elena said during one of their regular updates. The only question now is for how long and whether he'll cooperate with investigators to reduce his sentence. Sarah found that she felt very little about David's fate. The man she'd married had turned out to be a fiction, a character David had created to manipulate her and everyone else in his orbit. The real David Mitchell was someone she'd never actually known. What mattered now was Victoria, who was growing more alert and responsive every day. She smiled at 6 weeks, rolled over at 3 months, and seemed to study Sarah's face with the intense focus of someone trying to memorize every detail. She's going to be brilliant, Barbara observed as she watched Victoria track colorful toys with her eyes. Look at that concentration. Sarah hoped Victoria would be brilliant, but more than that, she hoped her daughter would be kind, honest, and strong enough to stand up for what was right even when it was difficult. Those were the qualities that would matter most in whatever life Victoria chose to build for herself. The financial settlement was finalized in March, with Sarah receiving $7.5 million in cash and assets, plus guaranteed child support until Victoria turned 18. The amount was enough to ensure Victoria's education would be fully funded, and that Sarah would never need to worry about basic financial security. More importantly, the Federal Restitution Fund was expected to provide additional payments over the next several years as prosecutors recovered assets from David's criminal enterprise. Sarah would donate most of that money to a scholarship fund for students pursuing research in artificial intelligence, a way of turning David's crimes into something positive for future innovators. You've come out of this stronger than I ever imagined possible, Elena said as they signed the final divorce papers. 6 months ago, you were a scared pregnant woman who just discovered her husband's affair. Now you're a successful businesswoman raising a beautiful daughter and helping other women reclaim their power. Sarah looked at Victoria, who was sleeping peacefully in her carrier, blissfully unaware of the legal proceedings that had shaped her first months of life. Her daughter would grow up knowing that her mother had fought for truth and justice, even when it would have been easier to take David's money and stay quiet. I'm not the same person I was when this started, Sarah realized. That woman was afraid of being alone, afraid of starting over, afraid of taking risks. This woman isn't afraid of anything. The transformation hadn't been easy, but it had been necessary. Sarah had discovered strengths she didn't know she possessed and built a life that was entirely her own creation. Victoria would grow up seeing that women could be independent, strong, and successful on their own terms. As they left the courthouse for the final time, Sarah felt a sense of completion that had nothing to do with revenge or financial settlements. She'd protected her daughter, helped expose a criminal enterprise, and rebuilt her life from the ground up. David had thought he could discard her like an outdated business plan. Instead, he'd freed her to become someone stronger than she'd ever imagined possible. The gavel fell with a sharp crack that echoed through the federal courtroom, marking the end of United States for David Mitchell. Sarah watched from the gallery as David was led away in shackles, his shoulders slumped in defeat. 23 years in federal prison, plus full restitution to victims. Justice, after 8 months of investigation and 3 weeks of trial. Victoria, now 4 months old, slept peacefully in Sarah's arms, oblivious to the historical significance of the moment. Sarah's daughter would grow up knowing that her father was a convicted felon, but she would also know that her mother had helped ensure he faced consequences for his crimes. "It's over," Elena whispered as they watched David disappear through the side door that led to the holding cells. "He'll be eligible for parole when Victoria's in college." The trial had been a media sensation, with daily coverage of testimony from David's victims. Dr. Jennifer Wu had taken the stand for 2 days, describing in meticulous detail how David had stolen her life's work and then destroyed her career when she tried to fight back. 11 other researchers had told similar stories of manipulation, theft, and retaliation. Brooke Palmer's testimony had been the most damaging to David's defense. She'd described their affair in clinical detail, explaining how David had recruited her specifically to help identify and target potential victims. Her cooperation with prosecutors had reduced her own sentence to 5 years, but her detailed knowledge of David's crimes had sealed his fate. Sarah had testified for 1 day, describing her gradual realization that her husband was not the man she thought she'd married. The prosecutors had been careful to portray her as another victim rather than a knowing participant, and the jury had clearly believed her testimony. "The defendant exploited everyone who trusted him," the lead prosecutor had said in his closing argument. "His wife, his employees, his investors, and most tragically, the brilliant researchers whose innovations he stole. David Mitchell is not a successful entrepreneur. He's a thief who used charm and manipulation to build an empire on other people's dreams." The defense had tried to paint David as a well-intentioned businessman who'd made ethical lapses under pressure, but the evidence was overwhelming. Federal investigators had recovered hundreds of documents proving systematic fraud dating back to the founding of Mitchell AI. Outside the courthouse, Sarah was surrounded by reporters asking for her reaction to the verdict. She'd prepared a brief statement with the help of her crisis management team. "Justice has been served for all of David's victims," she read from a prepared text. "My focus now is on raising my daughter and helping other women rebuild their lives after betrayal. I hope this case sends a message that no one is above the law, regardless of their wealth or status." The questions came rapid fire. How did she feel about David's sentence? Would she allow Victoria to visit her father in prison? Did she plan to write a book about her experience? Sarah answered a few questions, politely, then left with Victoria and her security detail. The media attention was intense but manageable, and public opinion remained strongly supportive of her decision to cooperate with prosecutors. That evening, Sarah's parents hosted a quiet celebration dinner at her Madison Park home. The guest list was small: Elena Rodriguez and her husband, Dr. Martinez and her partner, Marcus Webb, the private investigator, and a few close friends Sarah had reconnected with during her divorce. To Victoria, Elena raised her wine glass as they sat around Sarah's antique dining table. "May she grow up in a world where truth matters more than charm, and where women are never afraid to fight for what's right." The toast brought tears to Sarah's eyes. 6 months ago, she'd been an isolated, frightened woman who discovered her perfect life was built on lies. Now she was surrounded by people who'd helped her find the strength to not just survive, but to emerge stronger than before. "I want to thank all of you," Sarah said, adjusting Victoria in her high chair. "I couldn't have done this without your support and expertise." "You did the hard part," Elena replied. "We just provided the tools." You found the courage to use them. The financial settlement had been finalized the week before David's sentencing. Sarah's share of legitimate marital assets totaled $8.2 million, plus the Madison Park house and guaranteed child support. The federal restitution fund would provide additional payments over the next decade as prosecutors continued recovering assets from David's criminal network. More importantly for Sarah's sense of purpose, she'd used part of her settlement to establish the Victoria Rose Foundation, a nonprofit organization that provided legal and financial assistance to women escaping abusive marriages. The foundation had already helped 12 women navigate complex divorces involving hidden assets and domestic violence. "You're turning your pain into purpose," Dr. Martinez observed as she watched Sarah feed Victoria her evening bottle. "That's the healthiest possible response to trauma." Sarah's consulting practice continued to grow, with clients across the country seeking her expertise in career rebuilding and life transitions. She'd been featured in Forbes as one of the women to watch in the business consulting field, and speaking requests were coming in faster than she could accommodate. The professional success felt gratifying, but it was Victoria who gave Sarah's life its deepest meaning. Watching her daughter discover the world with wide-eyed wonder reminded Sarah daily of what truly mattered: love, truth, and the courage to protect what was precious. David had tried to contact Sarah twice since his sentencing, both times through his attorney requesting permission to see Victoria. Sarah had declined both requests. When Victoria was old enough to make her own decisions about her father, Sarah would support whatever choice she made. But for now, Sarah's priority was protecting her daughter from the chaos and pain of David's choices. Patricia Mitchell had made one more attempt at establishing a relationship with Victoria, this time through a formal letter requesting grandparent visitation rights. Elena had responded that Sarah was open to occasional supervised visits once Victoria was older, but that any contact would need to be approved through the court system. "They're probably decent people who raised a son who became a criminal," Elena explained, "but you have every right to control access to Victoria until she's old enough to understand the complicated family dynamics." The first anniversary of discovering David's affair arrived in late October, just before Victoria's first birthday. Sarah marked the date privately, reflecting on how dramatically her life had changed in 12 months. A year ago, she'd been a naive wife who trusted completely and questioned nothing. Now she was a successful entrepreneur, raising a beautiful daughter and helping other women find their strength. Victoria's first birthday party was a joyful celebration held in the backyard of their Madison Park home. The guest list included Sarah's parents, Elena and her family, several of Sarah's new clients who'd become friends, and the Mommy and Me group Sarah had joined when Victoria was 6 months old. "Look at her," Barbara Chen said with wonder as Victoria toddled unsteadily between party guests, her face bright with excitement. "She's going to be walking soon." Victoria had inherited her mother's determination and her father's intelligence, but she was developing a personality entirely her own. She was fearless in exploring her environment, gentle with other children, and fascinated by books and music. "She's going to change the world someday," one of Sarah's clients predicted as Victoria clapped enthusiastically during the singing of "Happy Birthday." Sarah hoped that was true, but more than that, she hoped Victoria would grow up understanding that she had choices, that she never needed to diminish herself for someone else's success. And that truth was always worth fighting for, even when the battle was difficult. As the party wound down and Victoria napped in her crib, Sarah sat in her garden watching the sunset over Lake Washington. The view was different from the one she'd had in Bellevue, smaller and more intimate, but it felt like home in a way the glass mansion never had. Her phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, Sarah's heart raced, wondering if David had somehow found a way to contact her directly. But the message was from Dr. Jennifer Wu. "Saw the news about Victoria's birthday party. She's beautiful. Thank you for having the courage to help us get justice. Your daughter will grow up knowing her mother is a hero." Sarah smiled, saving the message to show Victoria someday when she was old enough to understand the story of how her father's crimes had been exposed and how her mother had helped ensure he faced consequences. That night, as Sarah worked in her home office while Victoria slept, She received an email that would change the trajectory of their lives once again. The subject line read, "Book offer, your story could help millions." The email was from a prominent New York literary agent who specialized in memoirs by women who'd overcome extraordinary challenges. She wanted to represent Sarah in writing a book about her experience, discovering her husband's crimes, and finding the strength to start over. "Your story resonates with women across the country," the agent wrote. "There are millions of women in marriages where they've sacrificed their own dreams for their partner's success. Your journey from betrayal to empowerment could help them find their own strength." Sarah stared at the email for a long time, considering the implications. Writing a book would mean sharing the most painful details of her marriage and divorce with the world. It would mean reliving David's betrayal and the fear she'd felt during those early days of uncertainty. But it would also mean helping other women recognize the warning signs of financial abuse and emotional manipulation. It would mean turning her experience into a resource for women who needed to know they could survive and thrive after having their lives turned upside down. Sarah drafted a reply expressing interest and asking for more details about the proposed book project. Whatever she decided, Victoria would be her first priority. But if sharing her story could help other women find their strength, it might be worth the emotional cost of revisiting those painful months. As she prepared for bed, Sarah checked on Victoria one last time. Her daughter was sleeping peacefully, one tiny fist curled around her favorite stuffed elephant, her breathing steady and calm. "Sweet dreams, little one," Sarah whispered. "Tomorrow we'll start planning our next adventure." Victoria stirred slightly but didn't wake. Sarah stood in the doorway for another moment, marveling at how much their lives had changed since that rainy day in the hospital parking lot when she'd first discovered David's betrayal. They'd survived the worst year of Sarah's life and emerged stronger, healthier, and more purposeful than ever before. Whatever challenges lay ahead, Sarah knew she could handle them. She'd already proven she was capable of more than she'd ever imagined. The future stretched ahead, full of possibilities, and for the first time in years, Sarah couldn't wait to see what came next. The letter arrived on a Tuesday morning in March, delivered by a courier who required Sarah's signature and identification before handing over the innocuous manila envelope. Victoria, now 16 months old and walking with increasing confidence, was playing with blocks in the living room while Sarah sorted through the day's mail. The return address showed only a law firm in Geneva, Switzerland. Sarah's heart rate quickened as she opened the envelope and found a letter written in formal English with a slight European formality. "Dear Mrs. Mitchell," it began, "I represent certain business interests of Mr. Victor Petrov regarding assets held jointly with your former husband. Recent events require immediate discussion of matters that may significantly impact your financial interests and personal safety." The letter was signed by Dr. Heinrich Zimmer, attorney at law, and included a phone number with instructions to call within 48 hours. Sarah's hands trembled as she read the letter twice, trying to understand its implications. Victor Petrov wasn't a name she recognized from any of David's business dealings or the federal investigation, but the mention of jointly held assets and personal safety sent a chill down her spine. She called Elena immediately. "Don't call that number," Elena said sharply after Sarah read the letter aloud. "Don't respond at all until we understand what this is about. I'm contacting federal prosecutors immediately." Within 2 hours, FBI Special Agent Catherine Park was sitting in Sarah's living room while Victoria napped upstairs. Agent Park had been the lead investigator on David's case and had developed a respectful working relationship with Sarah during the trial preparation. "Victor Petrov is a Russian oligarch with suspected ties to organized crime," Agent Park explained as she studied the letter. "He's been on our watch list for years in connection with money laundering and cybercrime. If David had business dealings with Petrov, that opens up an entirely new dimension to his criminal enterprise." "What kind of business dealings?" "Cryptocurrency exchanges, shell companies, offshore banking. Petrov specializes in helping criminals hide assets from law enforcement. The fact that he's contacting you now suggests David hid more money than we discovered during our investigation." Sarah felt sick, just when she'd thought the nightmare was over, when she'd finally built a stable life for herself and Victoria. David's criminal past was reaching out to threaten them again. What does this mean for Victoria and me? Agent Park's expression was grave. It means you might be in danger. If Petrov thinks you have access to assets that belong to him, or if he sees you as leverage to use against David, he won't hesitate to threaten you directly. The FBI arranged for immediate protection while they investigated Petrov's claims. Sarah's house was equipped with enhanced security systems, and a team of federal marshals began conducting regular surveillance of the property. The isolation was difficult for both Sarah and Victoria. They couldn't leave the house without an escort, couldn't maintain their normal routines, couldn't live the peaceful life Sarah had worked so hard to build. Elena worked frantically to understand the legal implications of Petrov's letter. If David had indeed hidden assets in partnership with a Russian criminal, those assets might be subject to international asset forfeiture proceedings that could take years to resolve. The good news is that any assets hidden with Petrov are clearly criminal proceeds. Elena explained during one of their secure phone calls. You wouldn't have any legitimate claim to them anyway. The bad news is that Petrov might not understand or care about those legal distinctions. The breakthrough came when federal investigators discovered encrypted communications between David and Petrov dating back 3 years. The messages, found on a hidden server in David's office, revealed a sophisticated money laundering operation that had moved more than $50 million through shell companies and cryptocurrency exchanges. David wasn't just stealing intellectual property, Agent Park explained during a briefing at the FBI field office. He was washing the proceeds through Petrov's network, which charges a 30% fee for their services. Petrov thinks you might have access to $25 million that David promised him, but never delivered. The mathematics of greed laid bare in government spreadsheets and encrypted messages. David had promised Petrov a larger share of his stolen profits in exchange for more sophisticated money laundering services. When David was arrested before he could deliver on that promise, Petrov was left with a significant financial loss. He wants his money, Agent Park said simply, and he thinks threatening you might convince David to reveal where additional assets are hidden. Sarah's decision was easier than she'd expected. When Dr. Zimmer called again, demanding a response to his letter, Sarah was ready with an answer that had been carefully coordinated with federal prosecutors. Mr. Petrov can contact the United States Attorney's Office if he has legitimate claims regarding my former husband's assets, Sarah said during the recorded phone call. I have no knowledge of any business relationship between David and your client, and I have no access to any assets beyond those already identified in court proceedings. The response was delivered in a calm, professional tone that gave no indication of the FBI agents listening to every word or the protection team stationed throughout her house. Petrov's reaction was swift and predictable. Within hours of Sarah's phone call, federal investigators detected attempts to hack into her personal financial accounts, her business email, and even Victoria's pediatrician's medical records. The cyber attacks were sophisticated, but ultimately unsuccessful against the FBI's countermeasures. He's phishing, Agent Park explained, trying to find evidence that you're hiding assets or that you know more than you're admitting. The attacks suggest he doesn't actually have specific information about hidden money. The harassment campaign escalated over the following weeks. Sarah received threatening phone calls from untraceable numbers, found her car tires slashed in her driveway, and discovered that someone had attempted to break into her home office through a basement window. Victoria, thankfully, seemed unaware of the danger surrounding them. She continued her normal toddler activities under the watchful eyes of federal protection, playing with toys and books while armed agents monitored their home's perimeter. I won't let him terrorize us, Sarah told Elena during one of their strategy sessions. David already stole 8 years of my life. I won't let his criminal associates steal anymore. The solution came from an unexpected source, Brooke Palmer, who was serving her sentence at a minimum security federal prison in Oregon. Brooke reached out through her attorney, offering information about David's international business dealings in exchange for a reduction in her remaining sentence. Brooke helped David set up meetings with Petrov. Agent Park explained after interviewing Brooke at the prison. She has detailed knowledge of the money laundering operation, including the location of cryptocurrency wallets that Petrov doesn't know about. The hidden cryptocurrency wallets contained approximately $15 million in Bitcoin and Ethereum, stored on encrypted drives that David had hidden in safety deposit boxes across 3 states. The digital assets were untraceable by traditional investigative methods, but Brooke had been present when David created the storage system. Federal prosecutors offered Petrov a deal: complete information about David's hidden cryptocurrency holdings in exchange for an end to his harassment of Sarah and her daughter. The proposal was delivered through diplomatic channels, with the implicit understanding that continued threats against an American citizen would result in international sanctions against Petrov's business interests. Petrov accepted the deal with surprising grace. Within days of receiving the cryptocurrency wallet information, the threats against Sarah stopped completely. Phone calls ceased, cyber attacks ended, and surveillance teams detected no further attempts to monitor her activities. "Criminal businessmen are pragmatic," Agent Park explained. "Petrov got what he wanted: access to David's hidden assets. Continuing to threaten you would only draw more law enforcement attention to his activities." The resolution felt anticlimactic after weeks of fear and uncertainty. Sarah had been prepared for a prolonged battle against international criminals, but the conflict ended with a simple exchange of information and mutual agreement to leave each other alone. More importantly, the discovery of David's additional hidden assets meant that federal restitution payments to his victims would be significantly larger than originally projected. Dr. Wu and the other researchers who'd been robbed of their innovations would receive full compensation for their losses, plus damages for the years of career setbacks they'd endured. David thought he was so clever, hiding money where investigators would never find it, Elena said as they reviewed the final financial accounting of David's criminal enterprise. Instead, he just created a larger pot of money for his victims to share. The irony was fitting. David's greed and paranoia had led him to hide assets so well that even his criminal partners couldn't find them. Only Brooke's cooperation had revealed the full scope of his theft, ensuring that justice was finally complete. With the Petrov threat resolved, Sarah and Victoria were able to return to their normal routines. The federal protection was gradually reduced, the security systems were simplified, and their house felt like a home again rather than a fortress. Sarah's book proposal had been accepted by a major publisher, with a tentative release date in the fall. The memoir would tell the complete story of her journey from betrayed wife to empowered entrepreneur, including the recent threats from David's international criminal associates. "Your story keeps getting more dramatic," her literary agent observed during one of their planning calls. Publishers love narratives with international intrigue and federal investigations. More importantly to Sarah, the book would include practical advice for women navigating high-conflict divorces and rebuilding their lives after major betrayals. The appendix would feature resources for financial planning, legal assistance, and emotional support that could help readers facing similar challenges. Victoria's second birthday approached with the kind of normal anticipation that Sarah had almost forgotten was possible. No federal agents, no threatening phone calls, no hidden criminal assets casting shadows over their celebration. The party would be held in their backyard again, with friends and family gathering to celebrate how much Victoria had grown and learned over the past year. Sarah's guest list included Elena and her family, Dr. Martinez and her partner, several clients who'd become close friends, and the mommy group that had provided such crucial support during the dark months of legal proceedings. "She's walking, talking, and climbing everything in sight," Barbara Chen observed as she watched Victoria navigate the playground equipment at a nearby park. "She's going to be a force of nature." Sarah hoped Victoria would indeed be strong and determined, but she also hoped her daughter would choose to use those qualities for good rather than for personal gain at others' expense. The contrast between Victoria's innocent curiosity and David's calculating manipulation couldn't have been sharper. That evening, as Sarah put Victoria to bed, her daughter looked up at her with David's intelligent eyes, but with an expression of pure love and trust that David had never quite managed. "Mama," Victoria said clearly, one of the dozen words in her growing vocabulary. "Yes, sweetheart. Mama's here." "Home," Victoria added, snuggling into her favorite stuffed elephant. Home. Such a simple word that captured everything Sarah had fought to build over the past 2 years. Not just a physical space, but a sense of safety, love, and belonging that no one could take away from them. Sarah's phone buzzed with a text message as she left Victoria's room. For a moment, her heart skipped, wondering if some new threat was emerging from David's criminal past. But the message was from her literary agent. The publisher wants to fast-track your book release. They think it could be a bestseller if we publish before the holidays. Are you ready to tell your story to the world? Sarah considered the question as she looked around the home she'd created for herself and Victoria. Ready to relive the pain of discovering David's betrayal, ready to share the details of their financial struggles and legal battles, ready to help other women find the strength to leave abusive relationships and rebuild their lives. She typed her response. I'm ready. Let's help as many women as possible. The next morning brought news that David's parole request had been denied. He would serve his full 23-year sentence, ensuring that Victoria would be well into adulthood before her father was released from prison. Sarah felt no satisfaction at the news. David had made his choices and would face the consequences. But his continued imprisonment didn't change the fact that Victoria would grow up without knowing her father, except as a cautionary tale. What mattered was the life Sarah was building for herself and her daughter. A life based on truth rather than lies, on authentic relationships rather than manipulative calculations, on the kind of love that empowered rather than controlled. Victoria would grow up knowing that her mother had faced impossible choices and had chosen courage every time. She would understand that women didn't need to sacrifice their dreams for someone else's success. That truth was always worth fighting for, and that even the most devastating betrayals could become the foundation for a stronger, more authentic life. As Sarah sat at her desk working on the outline for her book, Victoria played quietly nearby with blocks and books, occasionally looking up to smile at her mother with the absolute trust of a child who'd never known anything but love and security. The story wasn't over. Victoria would face her own challenges and make her own choices as she grew up. But she would do so knowing that she came from a mother who'd refused to be defeated, who'd turned pain into purpose, and who'd proven that even the most carefully constructed lies eventually crumble before persistent truth. Sarah began typing the first chapter of her book. I thought I had the perfect life until I discovered it was built entirely on lies. The words flowed easily, carrying with them the weight of truth and the hope that other women would find the strength to write their own stories of survival and transformation. Outside, Seattle's spring rain began to fall, washing the city clean for another new beginning.